I wanted to talk to you about something known as the financial system, which you can see that I have highlighted at the top. So on your notes, if you could write the header as the financial system, because that's the main idea of what we're going to be talking about, and that's sort of the central focus here. So the financial system is probably something that you've heard about. At the very least, you've heard the word financial or finances. And when you hear that word, you probably think of things like money or banks or stocks or any of those kinds of things. And that's exactly sort of what I'm hoping that you'll think about, because that's pretty much what we're talking about. So the financial system basically is just a system of a bunch of organizations that all work together to receive one person's savings, to receive savings from people, and then connect that with another person's loan that they want to take out. So, for example, banks, as we know, and we'll talk a little bit about in more detail in a second, but you can go to a bank and you can put your savings. You can put your savings in a bank. So they'll collect your savings. They'll take that. You put your money in the bank, and then that'll be your savings you're putting in there. But you also know probably that you can go to a bank to get a loan too. So like if you're trying to buy a house or do student loans or get a car or you need money or whatever, you can go to a bank to get a loan. And so a bank is definitely an organization that matches savings with another person's loans. We'll talk a little bit about how that all works in just a minute. So one thing I want to point out that's cool about videos is that you're going to be able to pause it. So at this point, if you're still working on trying to write down all this stuff, now would be a really good time to just pause it and take a minute to write down some of those notes, and then jump back in once you are done doing that. Okay, so let's keep moving. I'll scroll down to the next slide. So financial institutions, and especially in the U.S., they really break down into two categories here. We have financial markets and financial intermediaries. So on your note sheet, you're going to want to break down those two categories, and we'll give a little bit more definition of what those two categories are. But one more time, we have financial markets as one category, and we have financial intermediaries as the other category. So go ahead, and you may want to pause now and go ahead and write that down. Okay, let's keep rolling. So some examples of some of the stuff that falls into those two different categories is in the financial markets, we have things like the stock market, which I know that you've heard of, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time in this dealing with, because we're going to spend a lot more time later, and we'll get to have you guys play with the stock market a little bit, and we'll go into a lot more depth. But the bond market is another example of a financial market, and we will talk about that here. An example of financial intermediaries are things like banks and mutual funds. So you can go ahead and pause now if that's the thing that you need to do. Okay. So what makes these things different? What makes financial markets different from financial intermediaries? Well, for financial markets, basically what financial markets do is they take money from the savers. They take these savers' money that they're putting in, and they provide this money directly to borrowers. So if you're dealing with a financial market, like the stock market, or you're dealing with the bonds market, basically you are putting money in. If you're a saver, you're putting your money in, and you know that your money is directly going to be given to borrowers. They're going, if you're buying stocks, you're saving your money in that stock, and then you know that your money is going directly to the company for whom you are getting stock from. Bonds work the same way. You're kind of doing it for that purpose. You're putting money in, and you know it's going directly to this other person. With financial intermediaries, it works indirectly. They still take the saver's money, and they still give that money to borrowers, but they do it indirectly. So, like a bank, you noticed, was an example of a financial intermediary. If you're going and you're saving your money in a bank, you aren't saying, oh yeah, I want to save my money in this bank so that they can give it as a loan. That's not really what you're interested in. You're not worried about whether or not they're giving it as loans. They will, but that's not why you do it. That's not the purpose. So they do it more indirectly. And so we'll visit it a little bit more when we get down to banks. But let's keep on moving. So let's talk about the bond market, which is, a a financial market as opposed to the intermediary. So the way that this works is a bond is kind of like a loan, but it's sort of like using you as the bank. So basically the way that this works is for a bond, you would give your money directly to a bank or to the government. So you would buy a bond, and then your money would go directly to this bank or government, whoever it is that's asking for this bond. Usually when people do bonds, they're giving it to the government, but you can also give it to banks. It kind of works both ways. But the way it works is that the government or the bank will sell you this bond, and then they will promise to pay back interest. It's actually a pretty great way of saving money for a lot of different people in a way that's pretty safe. My parents actually started saving money for me when I went to college by putting just about $100 every few months into a bond. And by the time that I was old enough to go to college, the government had paid interest on this bond, and there was more money than they'd put in. So it was a really great way for them to kind of save money or raise money really without actually doing anything. And a really great example of these would be war bonds, which I'm sure you talked about in American Studies, which is the thing that the government did to try to raise money for World War I and World War II. They basically put on all those events and said, "Hey guys, come buy war bonds," and then the people bought all these bonds, and then the money went directly to the government so that they could pay for all the stuff they needed for the war. And then once the war was over, the government paid back all of these bonds with interest in order to have the money that they needed when they needed it. So let's keep rolling. Some of the major characteristics of a bond, these are just sort of important to keep in mind. And this is not only characteristics of bonds, but also for loans. This kind of works both ways. But the first one is the term. So when you hear like the term of a bond or the term of a loan, what that means is that that's the length of time until it will be repaid. So like if you're getting a government bond, you might get like a 10-year government bond. And so what that means to you is that is how long the government has in order to pay off that loan. So like obviously they're trying to get money from you. They're selling the bond because they need money for something. So they're not really going to want you to have access to it immediately, or it's not going to be a benefit for them. But they'll give you a time limit for when you'll be able to have the bond later. But obviously that whole time they're going to be paying you interest. So it isn't like, a particular negative. It just sort of means that that's how long that you'll have to wait before you'll have access to your money again. Also, when it comes to loans and bonds, there's this thing known as credit risk, and you've probably heard this term before, and how risky a loan is, or how risky somebody's credit is. And ultimately, credit risk is responding to the probability that the borrower will fail to pay back some of the interest. So what this means is like if you are somebody who tries to buy a car on credit and then you have a hard time paying it back, or you're not making enough money, and you'll get a bad credit score. Basically, if you have this history of trying to get loans and then not being able to pay them off, and you have like a history of doing this, then you will be seen as having a credit risk. You'll be seen as risky. They'll see you as somebody who has a pretty high probability of not paying back some of this interest. And ultimately, that'll result in some people just won't give you loans anymore, and they won't give you credit cards, and it'll be really hard to be able to use credit or get loans, or because people will think that you're not as good with your money, that you can't really be trusted. Obviously, with a bond, with credit risk, we're pretty much hoping that the government is not such a risky investment. Like we're pretty sure that the government's going to be able to pay you back because they're, fairly rich as this organization that runs our whole country, at least if you ignore the national debt, which is a whole nother thing. But in theory, generally bonds are pretty low risk because the government generally is pretty good at being able to pay that stuff off. And then lastly, we deal with this issue of tax treatment. So how taxes interact with your bonds, and how many taxes you'll have to pay, or who has to pay the taxes. Does the borrower have to pay the taxes, or does the saver ultimately get taxed? And ultimately, it'll tell you what the story is whenever you're getting a loan or a bond. But also a thing to keep in mind is if you're dealing with municipal bonds, so like bonds for a city. Like if you're buying a bond for the city of Napa and you're giving Napa the money, they're pretty much federal tax exempt. They're not really taxed by the federal government. As just a sort of thing to keep in mind. So let's keep on moving on. So let's jump into intermediaries. So the one that's most obvious that I think you're going to deal with most are banks. And ultimately what they do is they will have people come in and, the deposit. They want to save their money in a bank, in a checking account or in a savings account. And they'll take this money that people are making as deposits, and basically they'll store all of that money, and then they'll take that money and then they'll use it as loans for borrowers. So if you go in and you're saying, hey, I just got my paycheck and I want to save my money in the bank, they'll take your paycheck and they'll say, awesome, and they'll keep track of the fact that it's your money, and then they'll save that money, and then they'll immediately turn around and then use that money in order to go ahead and give someone else a loan on your money. Obviously, it isn't like they will loan out all of the money and have no money in the bank anymore, because that's, what happened in the Great Depression. So there's a whole bunch of laws to make sure that that doesn't happen anymore. So banks now have laws about the certain amount of money that they have to keep on hand, so that if, people go to collect their money, there's still enough money for the average expectation of how many people would be coming in. But ultimately, that's sort of how the system works. And the way that banks make money, and the way that banks help you to make money, is that, of course, when you save your money in a bank, they will be paying you interest in order to thank you, sort of to pay you and thank you for the fact that they're able to use your money for these loans. So they're thanking you by paying you interest. But then also, when they're giving loans to borrowers, they're charging them interest. So banks make all of their money pretty much, and then are able to spend money entirely through interest. They just collect money, and then they charge borrowers interest, and they charge borrowers interest, and then they will pay you interest for your deposit. Usually, the interest that they charge other people is higher than the interest that they will pay you on your savings money, because that's sort of, they have employees that they have to pay, and that's how they sort of stay in business, is they have to be able to have more money coming in, than is leaving. But that's sort of how that works. So let's keep rolling. So also, the other intermediary example we talked about are mutual funds. And basically what a mutual fund is you give a mutual fund your money, and you make a plan and you give them money, and they collect all of this money from more than one person. So let's say I'm part of a mutual fund, and then Mr. Gailey is part of the same mutual fund. Basically, they'll take my money and they'll take her money that we give them, and they'll take money from a bunch of other people, and they put it all in this single fund, like all in this single account, and then they give it to professional investors. And these professional investors invest all of that money in that single fund into the stocks. And so basically, it makes it so that it's kind of like being able to play the stock market, but not have to know anything about it. You're sort of trusting these professionals who know what's going on to invest your money, and then be able to benefit, from the changes in the market and how that can ultimately earn you more money as the value of stocks raise. Or they'll make sure that, as the value of stocks drop, that they'll take your money out in time so you don't lose a whole bunch of money. And when you do a mutual fund, you can tell them if you want to put them in risky stocks, like ones that change a lot but have a good chance of going up high, or stocks that are low risk. So ones that, won't change as much, they won't earn you as much, but you have a much lower chance of losing money. So you have some control over that. It isn't like you're just trusting some weird guy to just do whatever he wants with your money. You have a certain amount of say. But also, they're pretty cool because they allow people with relatively small amounts of money to benefit from professional investment. So it isn't like, you have to have hundreds of dollars to be able to afford certain stocks. You can actually just have $50 or $75, and you can put it in this fund, and then the fund collectively with everybody's money, and it will be enough money to be able to afford some stocks. But then, you'll still represent a percentage of that with however much percentage you have, and then your money will still be able to benefit from that. It's really a pretty cool idea. So let's move on to the next piece. So really just some other financial institutions that we're not going to really talk about, but that are some pretty cool other alternatives for things that you can do for your money, are credit unions. Credit unions are pretty cool. You've probably heard about them. I actually bank at a credit union. I bank at Golden One. Um, and credit unions do some pretty cool stuff. But I won't necessarily spend a whole lot of time dealing with that because they have some slight differences from banks. Um, but if it's something that interests you, we can talk more about it, or you can look it up, of course. Also, pension funds. So pension funds are the things that where they collect money, for people's retirement. Um, so this is where people are saving money. Usually, people's businesses that they work for will save money and then put their money in a pension fund, so that these funds can also gain interest, and then be able to earn money for these people's retirement. Um, Also, there's insurance companies. So insurance companies, they collect. If you have insurance, you will pay this insurance company, and they will save that money. Basically, in theory, in order to, if something bad happens, that they can use that money that you've been paying to pay to make sure that that stuff is all well and good. So, like, if we're talking about medical insurance, basically you will pay monthly for your medical insurance, so that if you get like in a terrible car accident, your insurance will jump in and will help pay for that. So you don't have to have like all of this weird money saved away just in case something bad happens. You can just have an insurance company, take care of that, and you pay them a monthly fee, and then they'll worry about all of that other stuff and make sure that you're taken care of. And also loan sharks. So loan sharks are another financial institution. They are illegal generally, but they are worth mentioning. And they basically offer loans, but they are super high interest loans. And that's sort of what makes them illegal. Is they will give you money if you need it, and they don't take a look at how risky you are, because generally, honestly, people that are low risk can get loans from somewhere else, but people that have a hard time getting loans will go to loan sharks. And so the loan sharks are kind of counting on the fact that they're really risky, that there's sort of a low probability of these people being able to pay them back, and then they will just charge huge amounts of interest to counterbalance that, and then basically they just end up punishing them when they can't pay back. So just as sort of an interesting side note for when you hear about loan sharks, that's just kind of what it is. They just offer really high interest loans to people that are generally pretty risky. So that's pretty much it for this. There will be. I'm hoping that you enjoyed this. I'm hoping that this was an effective strategy, and I look forward to your feedback. All right, thanks.